welcome. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this is Ethics. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 9. So I hope you've been doing well, and I hope you've been watching the series here. In the last book, Book 8, we saw Aristotle introduce the discussion of friendship, and what we're going to see in this book is really Aristotle continue to expand friendship and even begin to relate the notion of friendship to the way in which we organize ourselves politically in terms of political arrangements and systems of government. Keep in mind that from the very beginning of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, his sort of one of the primary aims he's had is ultimately political science and political philosophy, right? Because he thinks that ethics, which is basically a philosophy or a reflection about proper and right action, ultimately funnels up and fuels into political science, because political science is also concerned with action, just not the action of individuals, but rather with the action of an entire community or a collective of individuals. So we're going to see him start to argue that in this book, and we'll see that even more in his last book, Book 10. So that's sort of where we're at, and that's where we're going to sort of jump into. Remember, hopefully you're able to keep all of this stuff in your mind as you're going through it. Remember, for Aristotle, it's a virtue ethics theory, a naturalistic ethics, in which the goal is ultimately to figure out what we can do to become happy. He thinks that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and based upon that, he's discussed the notion that virtue is the middle point, the mean, between excess and deficiency or excess and defect. So, and then he talks about all the different virtues. Friendship is really, in a certain way, at one point Aristotle does say that friendship is a sort of virtue or an excellence itself, but primarily Aristotle discusses friendship in the context of friendship being a necessary condition to have happiness. In other words, just having friends isn't enough to make you happy, but it really does look like that if you want to be happy, you have to have friends. So let's sort of jump into his discussion here. And also keep in mind that he distinguishes between three types of friendship. There is the friend of utility, the friend of pleasure, or the erotic friend, and then finally there is also the complete friend, your best friend, okay? So here he begins by really focusing on this discussion of, well, what happens when friends have dissimilar aims? That is, you have two friends and they both have certain aims and they have certain objects of their friendship, but what happens when they're not the same? What happens when friends relate to each other and they misunderstand the use they have for each other or what their friendship is about? In other words, why are some friendships transient? Why do some friendships just die? Well, answer says that, well, friends have dissimilar aims or objects of love. So when two friends have different objects of love, and that difference is at the center of their relationship as friends, then ultimately that friendship will destabilize. So he gives the example of two lovers. So imagine two people who are in love with each other, and they're involved romantically and intimately with each other, right? And imagine that one of those lovers' object is love, and that is they want pleasure, right? So the object of love is pleasure for them. They enjoy having sex, let's say. But the other lover, let's say, has a different object of love. For instance, perhaps their object of their friendship is one of utility. That is, maybe, for instance, they're interested in being with the other person because it's the best thing for all of the other things in their life, right? Maybe an example would be, imagine, for instance, if you have imagine if you have a man, or it could be a woman, but it doesn't matter. But imagine if you have a man who is in love, but only in love erotically with their lover, while their lover, the woman, let's say, is with the man because they want the benefits. Maybe there's financial benefits, for instance. And that's why they're with this person. Well, you can see pretty clearly that when two lovers have dissimilar aims, their friendship is not going to last. And by the way, one thing I should say too is that when Aristotle used the term friendship, in many ways he's not just talking about friendships in the way we think of them, but he's really thinking about all forms of relationship you can have with other people that are friendly forms of relation, right? So friendship here is meant really, I think, to cast a very wide net, as it were. So, but ultimately this means that friendships of dissimilar aims continue or preserve because it is proportion that equalizes the party, right? So you can ask here, well, if two people have a relationship with dissimilar aims and their relationship doesn't end, why doesn't it? And the answer is somehow the proportional difference between their aims is somehow rectified. And the example Aristotle gives is of money in the shoemaker, right? So when you go to buy a pair of shoes, that money is given to the shoemaker, right? At least in the Aristotelian world. And you have different aims, right? Your aim is to get shoes. The shoemaker's aim is to continue their livelihood, right? And so you have different. There's an example of dissimilar aims, but based upon how much money you pay for the shoes, you can equalize that dissimilar proportion, if you will. So for Aristotle, there's a sort of mathematics to it, if you will, and this includes really his discussion of all contracts and services that we have really funnels into this category, right? So for Aristotle, that means that the economics of the city, of the polis, is ultimately grounded in some form of friendship or relationship that different people have within the society with each other. So even philosophy for him is about this, right? He says, and this is interesting, I think, I just threw it in here. I don't think it's a central insight or anything, but he says, and quote, and so too it seems, should one make a return to those with whom one has studied philosophy. For their worth cannot be measured against money, and they can get no honor which will balance their services, but still it is perhaps enough, as it is with there's some sort of spelling, as it is with others and with one's parents, to give them what one can. And sorry, I bungled that quote when I typed it. But I love that quote because he sort of says, yeah, even the person who teaches philosophy like me, you should repay them. Even though you can't ultimately repay them, but you give them what you can. So if you're enjoying this video channel, feel free to send me some cash. Otherwise, enjoy the philosophy. But in all seriousness, for Aristotle, contracts and services, right, and even philosophy, all of this happens within the spirit of friendship. So if we were going to sort of kind of create a theoretical hierarchy with which to understand Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we could say that under this category of friendship is ultimately where Aristotle would want to talk about the necessary features of social life, such that persons can engage with each other with different aims and yet still remain some sort of to remain ethical towards each other, as it were. Now, the next thing here is that it's clear that there are conflicts between friends, right? So the question is, to what degree should we defer our judgments to friends, right? So if I think something and my friend thinks the reverse, how much of my judgment should I weigh against what they say, and should I even just relinquish my judgment to my friends, right? How do I know how to deal with these sorts of conflicts? Well, Aristotle says, quote, whether one should in all things give preference to one's father and obey him, or whether one is ill, one should trust a doctor, and when one has to elect a general, should elect a man of military skill. And similarly, whether one should render a service by preference to a friend or to a good man, and should show gratitude to a benefactor or oblige a friend if one cannot do both. Again, a couple of spelling errors in there. But you can see what Aristotle's asking is, listen, the question about the deferring of our judgments to our friends applies to a whole range of things, right? Should we trust our father and obey them even though it may not be reasonable? Should we trust a military man and elect a general to take that job, right? Should you go to a friend or to someone else, for instance, if you need help, and so on and so forth? And what are the sorts of obligations we have to our friends, especially when there's conflicts? And Aristotle says immediately, well, there's no precision to the answers that these questions raise, which means that from Aristotle's perspective, this really has to be taken in a case-by-case basis. That is, perhaps Aristotle might say that one of the jobs of being a friend is precisely to continue working on weighing these things. Now, Aristotle does distinguish a couple things that we can mention. He says, for instance, that, quote, we must, for the most part, return benefits rather than oblige friends. So his view here is that we should give to our friends more than we receive to them, essentially. And we should return the benefits of friendship more than we require the benefits of friendship. Another one, quote, we should not make the same return to everyone, nor give a father that preference in everything. So he does say that He doesn't think that we should treat everyone in the same way, and he doesn't think that we necessarily should give our fathers the preference to obey them when they do something, when they demand something unreasonable. So you can see here is that Aristotle is sort of straddling back and forth in terms of evaluating these cases. And part of the reason he does that is because, remember, in Aristotle's virtue theory, what's more important about what sort of actions is who or what kind of person will act. And his view is that if you have an excellent, just person who has those character traits, then they will tend to be able to make the right decision in these fine-grained problems. There is no precise answer to these because ultimately life is too big and too messy for us to incorporate all possibilities under a universal prescriptive answer. So Aristotle doesn't want you to give up the business of thinking and reflecting ethically to some sort of formula or algorithm. So theoretically, it's not going to be given. He also adds, quote, to all older persons too, one should give the honor appropriate to their age by rising to receive them and finding seats for them, and so on, while to comrades and brothers, one should allow freedom of speech and common use of all things. So Aristotle suggests here that there is a degree of respect that's required in terms of two friends who are of different age, or two people who are relating in friendly ways with each other. It looks like he says that the older person should be given more respect than the younger people. And in fact, we even still do some of this today, quite a bit, I think. And he says, for instance, when it comes to your friends and your comrades and your brothers, you should allow them freedom of speech, and you should allow them the common use of all of your things. So you can see here is that there are, depending upon the person towards whom we're acting, there seems to be different implications in terms of what the morally right thing to do. So what do we do? Well, the answer is we just have to decide the questions the best way we can. We have to tackle this stuff in a sort of case-by-case basis in the Aristotelian world. And the best way we can tackle those questions is ultimately by inculcating and habitualizing the conduct of right and just virtuous action. So what happens, though, about friendships that die? What about the dissolution of friendships? And I like that term there, because what we're talking there is that when you have a friendship, friendships die. What happens is they seem to dissolve. So here we're talking about the dissolution of friendships. Aristotle has a couple different points here, right? He says, quote, most differences arise between friends when they are not friends in the spirit in which they think they are, right? Which I think is probably very wise. In other words, the differences between friends arise when friends misunderstand each other, and they misunderstand their friendship and the relationship that friendship entails. This happened to me just the other day. A friend of my neighbors was over at his house, and so I went over to their house, and there was one of his friends is a woman from New York. And her and I, we've met each other, we've talked to each other, and I kind of consider her one of my friends too. Not too close, but a friendly person. And it was interesting because I said a joke to her that I thought she would get a kick out of because she's from New York and I lived in New York. But she didn't think the joke was very funny. In fact, she seemed to get offended over it. I felt bad, but that's an example where I realized that the difference between our friendship arose because perhaps there was a misunderstanding regarding the relationship. I thought that since we were both from New York, perhaps there was a sort of internal, friendship we could have there. But I think I was wrong, and I think I misunderstood her, and that's all right. We're still friends, so we'll still be friends, I think. But I think there's something right about Aristotle's insistence that the differences between friends seem to arise when we misunderstand the spirit of our own friendship. We misunderstand each other. And this perhaps is why it's so important for friends to listen to each other. Another way with which friendships can dissolve is when you have changes in virtue or character over time. So for instance, and Aristotle mentioned this again, but for example, if over time, right, it becomes clear that two friends have very, very different senses of what virtue is, what wrong and right is, well, and they have character traits that accompany those differences, well, it's pretty clear that at some point that friendship is going to enter a very strained period if it doesn't just outright fall apart. So changes in virtue in our general character can dissolve a friendship. And this may be why, for instance, as we get older, we naturally seem to gain new friends, new types of friends, and we also lose older friends. And that may be why. But another question is, what about if your friend begins to act wrongly, right? Let's imagine your friend, decides that imagine, for instance, you have a friend who decides they're going to cheat on their wife. So this actually happened to me. Should you break the friendship off, right? Because here they're doing something that's wrong, but it's sort of none of my business, right? So where is my friendship? What am I obligated to do? What's the ethical action here? Well, Aristotle says, well, the first thing you should try to do is you should try to reform your friend. So that means, for instance, not just abandoning my friend, but speaking to her or him in order to see if I can reform them in terms of their wrong actions. Or another example would be, imagine, for instance, if you had a friend who became a coke and a heroin addict, right? And there are people out there who struggle with these things, right? But for instance, if you had a friend who is constantly on heroin and taking cocaine, eventually you'd probably stop hanging out with them, right? Because if you're not going to participate in those activities, then the bonds of your friendship naturally come under strain. And so Aristotle suggests, well, first you should try to reform them. But ultimately, if you can't, you may have to end the friendship, right? He says that ultimately the way we can understand this distinction is to recognize that friends who become friendships under threat of dissolution are friendships in which there is some sort of large interval. There's some sort of chasm that opens up between the friends in terms of the relationship. That can either be, and remember, the objects of friendships love are what Aristotle thinks are important here. So that could be in terms of the usefulness of the timing of our relationship. It could be in terms of the erotic or the pleasure that we get out of a friendship. It doesn't have to. By the way, I don't think it has to always be erotic either. You have friends. Friends love to laugh with each other and enjoy each other. And that is a pleasure potentially. And then of course your complete friends, right? But his suggestion here is that the larger the interval between the virtue of friends, the more difficult it is to keep the friendship. So the bigger that chasm between the mean and the excess, or the mean and the defect, if our friendships, we start diverging in more and more of my character traits are in the excessive side, then eventually I'll start to lose my friends who are more moderate. And this is sort of natural. But you should first try to reform your friends, help them out, come to their aid. But then at some point, if they really truly are acting wrongly, it may be the most ethical thing, which is just to dissolve or suspend a friendship. Now, another interesting question here is self-love and friendship. And here Aristotle is sort of interested in thinking about the relationship between, well, to what degree should my friends be the subject of my primary concern, or is my own self-interest, is that more important? So what is the relationship between self-love and friendship? Well, Aristotle suggests that friendly relations appear to arise out of a person's relation to themselves. So when you see people who interact in a friendly way to others, it seems that their interactions are ultimately rooted in the way in which they are resolved to treat and understand themselves within that relationship. So it looks like that there is a degree of subjective priority when we look at friendship, right? The love of the friend arises out of self-love, but only if the self-lover is good, right? So his view here is that you do have self-love, but but self-love has to be good, right? And the reason is pretty simple, because if a person loves themselves, but they're evil, right, then they will ultimately destroy and hurt themselves, right? He says, quote, "Therefore the bad man does not seem to be amicably disposed even to himself, because, well, there's nothing in him to love. So that if this is to be the height of his righteousness, we should strain ever nearer to avoid wickedness and should endeavor to be good. So no one may be both friendly to oneself and a friend to another." So his view here is that self-love is not a problem, right? So much as if you are a good person, or if you have the object of your actions are good actions, you have virtue and so on and so forth, then his view here is that self-love is not a problem at all, right? What we do recognize is that sometimes people are just selfish in their relationships. And this selfishness, he seems to align with someone who has bad interest at heart rather than good interest, right? So let's think now in terms of the goodwill in friendship. What about the idea that if you just simply wish someone good, is that friendship? Well, Aristotle says no, it's not, right? So for him, friendship is something more than simply having the goodwill towards others, right? So what we can say here is that goodwill is not a friendship. And the point number two, goodwill is not a friendly feeling either, right? So what is goodwill? Well, the reason he says goodwill is not a friendly feeling is because in order to have a friendly feeling, Aristotle suggests that there has to be some sort of intensity of passion or desire that's directed towards that person. But simply having goodwill, just for instance saying, I hope you have a good day, and whatever that means, right? That doesn't seem to be good enough as saying you have a friendly feeling, or certainly not a friendship. So and you'll see in this section, Aristotle is more focused on the goodwill. He says that the goodwill can arise spontaneously, but the difference is that friendship requires time. And this seems to be quite true if you look at your ordinary experience, right? That you can have sort of friendliness and you can have goodwill towards people, but friendship itself is something that develops, right? It's not something that one just discovers, it seems, right? He says maybe when we have goodwill to others, it's something like an inactive friendship, right? It's friendship without the agency of the other person, right? So because goodwill can simply be one-sided, right? Both parties don't have to have both parties don't have to have goodwill in order for you to have the goodwill or good intentions for other people. And so it says, so the next question is, well, why do we have goodwill, and where does the goodwill seem to arise from? And his answer is, well, the goodwill tends to, quote, arise on account of some excellence or worth, end quote, some sort of virtue. So it looks like that the goodwill does arise out of some sort of sense of virtue, excellence, or worth for the other person in some way, and then to recognize that implicitly or explicitly, perhaps, I guess. So, okay, now let's think about friendship and concord. To what degree do friends need to agree with each other? And here we'll see that Aristotle is really starting to get really interested in questions that relate to political science. Well, point one here is that unanimity is a friendly relation, but it is not the identity of opinion, right? So, for instance, if all the citizens of a city had the same opinion, we don't say that they're unanimous. But we only say that they're unanimous when they have the same opinion and choose the same actions. So unanimity refers to not just opinion, but also action. And this is a good example of this. Remember, if you've ever been on a committee or you've been in a student senate or you've seen the government people vote or whatever, and everyone votes, we say that the decision is unanimous. Well, why do we say that? We don't say it because everyone thinks the same thought. We do because everyone thinks the same thought, and they've all agreed to raise their hand in concord with each other. And so unanimity is not just a type of knowledge I have, and we just have the same sorts of knowledge, but it concerns action itself, right? So what this means is that unanimity is a political form of friendship, because unanimity is the way in which we act as agents with others. So here you can think about there's a whole range of interesting discussions one could have regarding, for instance, social groups that create social cohesion, or think about, for instance, political protest groups. There's a whole range of these sorts of political forms of friendship that we could apply here. And unanimity seems to be one of the categories that specifically falls under that. So number 4 here, or letter 4, no, that isn't number 4, I'm out of it today, right? Is that only the good can be unanimous with each other. Bad people can only be unanimous to a small extent, for their badness tends to create a state of faction. So Aristotle's notion here is that it's not always the case, obviously, but when you see a community that's consistently unanimous, and that means both in its opinion and in its actions, then what you have here is you most likely have a case in which people are good people. Because bad people can't maintain that fidelity of unanimity with others for long. Because ultimately, when people act excessively or viciously, what happens is that they begin to injure others. And when they injure others, then that destroys the ability for people to act together in concert, or it destroys their opinion of each other, right? So this means that the badness of a person is sort of an instability, right? A person, and this seems to be right. How many of us have known someone who was kind of a bad person or made things difficult for others, right? What tends to happen is that those people cannot interact for very long with large groups, because ultimately they begin to create forms of faction within the group. Now, let's sort of reverse it here instead of thinking about that and think about active benevolence and friendship. And here I want you to think about, well, ask the question, well, what about the love between a benefactor and the benefited? Who loves more? And think here of, for instance, one of these famous, think about one of those famous painters who has a benefactor, someone who gives them money and helps support them, right? Obviously, there's a sort of friendly relationship there. Well, who should be loved more, right? Should the benefactor love the benefited, or should the benefited, almost in response as a favor, love the benefactor more, right? So in other words, is the benefactor benefited a relationship of debtor and creditor, right? Because that seems to be the way we're structuring it. And Aristotle's answer is, well, no, right? Number one is, for the economic relations require no friendliness, right? Simply having economic relationships, that is a relationship between a debtor and a creditor, is not the same thing as having friendship. And so that means when we talk about a friendship between a benefactor and a benefited, that can't be the right way of looking at it. So what is Aristotle's view? Well, he argues that the benefactor ultimately must love the benefited more, because they see the benefited, the person who accepts their money or their patronage, right? They see them as their own handiwork. Aristotle says, quote, again, all men love more what they have won by labor. For example, those who have made their money love it more than those who have inherited it. And so his view here is that, well, what this means here is that ultimately the benefactor sees the person they're helping out with as an extension of themselves. So this sort of brings us back to self-love, right? And here we see Aristotle beginning to distinguish self-love and selfishness in a much clearer way, right? And he says this, well, should a man love himself or herself most, or others, right? Should we love other people more than ourselves, or should we be our own top dog, right? Well, Aristotle sort of begins to look at this by saying, well, we seem to blame the self-lover as being selfish and praise the one who loves others selflessly as being more honorable. So it looks like the person who's a big self-lover, we tend to blame more and make more negative moral judgments than a person who's selfless. Now, this doesn't answer the question, but it begins by allowing Aristotle to seize upon a specific clue regarding the way in which we recognize some sort of praiseworthiness or blameworthiness for an action. So, well, what is a lover of the self? Well, there's a couple different views. The reproachful view, which is the view that says it's bad to be a self-lover, sees the self-lover, sees that what the self-lover does is they assign themselves a greater share of wealth regarding their relationship to others. So in other words, the lover of self seems to treat themselves as more important. And that seems problematic, hence it's the reproachful view. But the view of reproach seems to apply when the lover of self is concerned with certain sorts of objects. So in other words, the reproach criticism here seems to only apply to a specific band of cases that concern specific types of objects, right? And so, for instance, a self-love of courage and honor is not a subject of reproach. So, for instance, again, Aristotle doesn't deny self-love, but what he does seem to suggest is that so long as a person loves the right things about themselves, then it's okay to be a self-lover, right? A person who loves courage and is courageous, who has a problem with that, right? It's when, namely, people have vices that they love with regard to themselves. So Aristotle says that the virtuous person who seeks virtue in all things is a self-lover too. Therefore, quote, the good man should be a lover of self, but the wicked man should not. Right. So it all hinges ultimately on the breakdown of virtue here. Now, but why are friends needed? We began the video here by suggesting that friends are a necessary condition for the happy life. Why is that exactly? Well, number one, and this is where Aristotle begins his question of the section, is does the happy person need friends, or are friends merely just needed in times of adversity? In other words, should you be a fair weather friend, and is that good enough, right? Just having friends when you need them and not having friends when you don't need them, right? This seems problematic because you can already see how can you maintain your friendship under those conditions. Well, what does Aristotle say? He says, well, even happy people live with others. And it is better to spend time with friends than with strangers. So therefore, happy people need friends to spend time with. Um, Also, and remember here is that for Aristotle, happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So it is an activity. It's not a state like pleasure is a state, but it rather is a doing of something, right? So this is very interesting. Happiness is not something that you gain and achieve and put under your mattress. Happiness is something you do out in the world amongst others, right? So that's it. Happiness is an activity, and it's a rational activity. So what that follows, therefore, then, is that happiness is concerned with something that's actually more pleasant and pleasureful, and that also means that it can't be merely solitary and singular, right? A certain excellence arises from out of the company of the good, Aristotle has told us. So one of the things you have to do in an activity is why do you need friends? Well, you need good friends because good friends help to inculcate good habits into you. So friends are extremely important to ultimately develop your own virtuous capacities. And Aristotle gives a second argument. He says, but if life itself is good and pleasant, and well, if perceiving that one lives is one of the things that are pleasant in themselves, and if life is desirable, and particularly so for good men, because to them existence is good and pleasant, and if, as the virtuous man is to himself, he is to his friends also, then, well, his own existence is desirable, for each man so, almost so, is that of his friend. So, in other words, friendship is really quite critical and an important element for living a happy life for Aristotle. Now, the next question is, well, how many friends do you need? Remember, we can distinguish at least 3 types of friends, but Aristotle will go ahead and distinguish 4. You should recall some of them. First, you have friends of utility, and remember, friends of utility are friends whose your relationship with them revolves around their usefulness in some way, right? So think about the friendly boss to the friendly employee, right? The boss needs the employee, so it's a friendship of utility. Now, and Aristotle says, well, since it's based upon use, then you should have as many of these friends as you need. In other words, have as many utilitarian friendships as you actually need for the use of living, for the uses that are needed in living your life, right? So friends of utility, have as many as you want, but remember, these friendships are organized around their utility. So you'd only want to stick to the utility. You don't want to have an excess there, right? Also, friends of pleasure. These are erotic friends, right? And his view is here is that, well, few are far enough. And he even says, I love this little phrase I put here. He says, having friendships of pleasure, particularly erotic friendships, it's like a little seasoning in food is enough. So you only need a few of these friends, right? You shouldn't need a lot. Now, complete friends, he doesn't talk about in this section, but I put it on here because he does talk about complete friends elsewhere in the book. We have a few of these friends by definition, so we don't have a ton of them. Whoa, let's go back here. So what you really need are friends who are good, right? Because good friends beget goodness in you. So how many of these friends did you have? Well, there is some sort of fixed number. So you want to get a lot of these friends, but you won't want to get too many, right? Because you want to still be a good friend. So there is some sort of fixed number. Having none is not good enough, and having 1,000 is probably too much, right? So you probably don't need as many friends as possible as you think you might, but have as many as are enough for the purposes of your living together with those friends in common community and concord, right? The person who is friends with everyone is said to have no friends. So be content with a few good friends instead, okay? Now, what happens when we have friends who are in good times and bad times, right? So recently, as you know, with Hurricane Harvey, my house flooded, and I had all these friends come and help me in my ill fortune. Well, what's Aristotle's view on this? Well, he says friendship is actually needed more in bad fortune than it's needed in good fortune, right? When everything's going hunky-dory, you don't need friends the way you need them when things go wrong, right? So that's an interesting point. It means that friendships must also play a social function that enables us to sort of overcome things to promote this greatest happiness. Number 3, he says, quote, it is fitting to go unasked and readily to the aid of those in adversity. So part of his quote here is that you should be ready to go help others when your friends are in times of need. You should be able to do it quickly and without being asked to do it. When he also says in number 4 here is that when our friends are prosperous and they have lots of wealth, we should, quote, join readily in their activities, but be tardy in coming forward to the objects of their kindness. So in other words, when your friends are prosperous, feel free to go with them and enjoy their life with them, right? But in terms of coming forward regarding how, needing money and needing help, you should go to them slowly. Be tardy in that. So he doesn't think you should run in and start asking people for money if you've gone through a great tragedy. Or maybe he would say is that he doesn't think we should expect our friends to do this, right? Especially our friends who are good friends. Okay, number 12 here, section 12, which concerns the shared activity in friendship. And this is the entire section, so I'm just going to read it to you because it's quite short. He says, quote, "What the erotic lover loves most is the sight of his beloved. And this is the sort of perception he chooses over the others, supposing that this, above all, is what makes him fall in love and remain in love. In the same way, surely, what friends are find most choiceworthy is living together. For friendship is community, and we're related to our friend as we're related to ourselves. So hence, since the perception of our own being is choiceworthy, so is the perception of our friend's being. Perception is active when we live with them. Hence, not surprisingly, this is what we seek, right? So whenever someone has regards his being or the end for which he chooses to be alive, that is the activity he wishes to pursue in his friend's company. Hence, some friends drink together, others play dice, while some go to gymnastics and go hunting, or do philosophy. They spend their days together on whichever pursuit in life they like most. For since they want to live with their friends, they share the actions in which they find their common life. Hence, the friendship of base people turns out to be vicious, for they're unstable and share base pursuits, and by becoming similar to each other, they grow even more vicious. But the friendship of the decent person, well, it is decent, and it increases the more often the friends meet. And they seem to become still better friends from their activities and their mutual correction. For each molds the other as what they approve of, so that you will learn what is noble in noble people. So much for friendship. The next task is to begin with pleasure. So that concludes our video series for today on Aristotle's Book 9. That finished up Aristotle's discussion of friendship, which I hope you find interesting. In our next video, we're going to finish up Aristotle's Ethics with Book 10, which starts off with the discussion of pleasure, then goes into sort of basic ethical theory, and then it sort of concludes with a brief discussion regarding some of the criticisms of Aristotle's ethics now that we've read through the whole book. Okay, I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys online. Bye.